Welcome to the Lexington Public Library's Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast, where we discuss everything Lexington and Fayette County history. I'm Miriam, and in each episode of this podcast, we will feature a guest that will share a piece of local history. So thank you for tuning in and enjoy.
Welcome to the Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast, where we tell stories of Lexington, Kentucky's history and people. I'm David Bryant, librarian at Lexington Public Library, filling in for Miriam, our regular host. Today, I'm talking to Wayne Johnson, a regular guest on the podcast, about Lexington, Kentucky street names, and specifically, we are talking about streets named after horses. Welcome to the podcast, Wayne.
Thank you. Where's Miriam?
She'll be back.
Oh, good.
During the week of June 5th, we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of Secretariat winning the Triple Crown with a slate of programs and activities. This podcast goes along with those activities that are all listed on the calendar on our website. And before we get started, I wanted to share a little bit about how we came up with this topic. And Wayne, just jump in anytime. Customers regularly come into the Kentucky Room doing research that involves a location on a street that has changed names. So one day I threw out the idea that I would like to research the names of Lexington street names for a podcast. That was when Wayne informed me that he has already done the research and has files of hundreds of Lexington streets. So knowing that, I really can't compete with that. So Wayne agreed to do the podcast, to be interviewed.
The way I got interested in this topic is, 25, 30 years ago, I had a call here at the library and a customer wanted to know the origins of the road Chinaway. And I had to research it. And this is probably before we got the internet or right when we got the internet. But I thought it was an interesting question, and it just really got me interested in, since I'm from Lexington, it got me interested in street name origins and place name origins. That's where I got started with it. And this is part one of a two-part podcast on this topic. And if people will tune in to the second podcast, they'll find out about Chinaway name origin.
Okay, great. So
it's not horse related, so we won't mention it.
So we'll save that for later.
Yes.
So just to kind of get the conversation started, what are some of the more famous streets named after horses, and what can you tell us about them?
Okay. Well, the first two I have that I want to talk about today, of course, Man of War Boulevard is one of the major thoroughfares here in the city. It's named after Man of War, the famous racehorse of the early 20th century. Now, Man of War Boulevard was completed in late 1988, but the plans for it went back several decades before. They planned Man of War a long time before it was completed. And for a number of years during the planning stage, it wasn't going to be called Man of War. It was going to be called Tiverton Way. But in 1974, the Urban County Council decided that the road would be named Man of War in honor of the famous racehorse, not Tiverton Way. Now, another name that was mentioned as a possibility for this road was Adam Rankin. Was for Adam Rankin, the famous Lexington pioneer. But City Council decided to name it after Man of War. And normally, streets aren't named by the Urban County Council. We'll talk more about that later. But for this was I think a state-built road, so the Urban County government got involved, council, and named it after Man of War. Now, the name Man of War, he was named by the wife of the owner of Man of War at the time that Man of War was born, and August Belmont Jr. bred Man of War. And this was during World War I. So shortly after Man of War was foiled, August Belmont Jr. joined up with the army and went over to France. And his wife, in honor of him serving in the war, decided to name the new colt, Man of War, to honor her husband.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's fascinating. There's so much history and things all around us, like street names that we don't really know all the time. So it's really fascinating to hear the stories behind it. So are there other streets you wanted to point out?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
The two main ones I was going to start off with was Man of War, which is 16.1 miles around. Of course, it doesn't completely encircle Lexington like New Circle Road does, but I think it goes from Versailles Road from the west side all the way to the east side at the interstate. I've driven Man of War. I actually prefer driving Man of War instead of New Circle Road. I got too many stories about New Circle Road. The next one I want to talk about is Oliver Lewis Way.
Okay.
Now, that's the name that was chosen for the Newtown Pike extension. The name was chosen in a 2010 contest where citizens submitted suggestions for the new road. And a committee narrowed the names to a list of 5 for this new road. Boulevard Street was one, Equestrian Boulevard, Millennium Road, Mary Todd Lincoln Boulevard, and Oliver Lewis Way. Well, Oliver Lewis Way, which was suggested by a Lexington citizen, I think her name was Julie Galbraith, if I remember correctly. The voting was through the Urban County government website, and thousands of people voted, and Oliver Lewis Way easily won the contest. Now, Oliver Lewis was jockey for the Aristides, the first winner of the Kentucky Derby in 1875.
Okay.
Well, Aristides was the first Kentucky Derby horse to win the race in 1875, and Aristides has a road named after him. I think it's off of Newtown around Griffin Gate, if I remember correctly. Don't hold me to that. But
we'll believe you.
Yeah. But anyway, Aristides has an interesting name, and apparently the owner of the horse had a timepiece watch manufactured by a watchmaker to Queen Victoria back in the 1800s. And this timepiece made such an impression on the owner's friend that the owner of Aristides decided to name the horse after the friend, whose name was Aristides Welch, who presented the timepiece to the owner was H. Price McGrath. And that's how Aristides got his name.
Yeah, all of this is really interesting. And I wonder if you want to just talk a little bit about how you collect this information. Where do you go? Do you go to newspapers? What are your sources?
Most of them are newspapers. There's no book or resource. So just whenever I run across a story in the Herald Leader, doing research here, sometimes they'll do stories on name origins of streets. And I've just collected them over the years, and I have a little notebook, and I just write it down. And so it's mostly newspapers. Occasionally I'll ask a customer or a person I know that mentions a road and has been around for a while, and I'll ask them, hey, do you know how that road received its name? And sometimes they know, and but it's mostly newspaper articles.
Yeah, definitely. And people, like as I mentioned earlier, people do regularly come in researching a property or a house, and the street has changed names. And
another interesting thing too, people might think that the government comes up with these names. Well, the planning division of the urban county government has to approve names, but it's up to the developer of the neighborhood or the street to submit a name. And in fact, in my research over the years, developers, they do not like that part of developing. There's been a couple who have said that's the hardest part of the whole process is coming up with a name. And developers will come up with themes like Kentucky cities, parks, rivers, and it's really a hard process if you think about it.
I imagine.
And we'll talk about a few of those. But also there's rules as to what you can submit as a name. In the city ordinance for street names, it says all addresses must contain a street name, of course, and such names may contain a maximum of 20 letters. So you can't come up with a street name of more than 20 letters. However, such names shall not contain fewer than 2 letters.
Huh.
a boulevard is not going to be a street ever, according to the city ordinance. And they have some prohibitions here for what's not allowed in street names, not allowed punctuations, not allowed numerical digits or numerical names. Now, streets like 3rd Street, 2nd Street, they were grandfathered in after this ordinance, so we're not going to be changing their names. And then you can initiate a street name with a directional term, like we have North Broadway, South Broadway. Again, we're not getting rid of those, but any new streets can have a north, south, west, east designation. And you can't have any confusing, obscene, or irregular spelled words for your street name. And you can't have names that duplicate or closely resemble names that are already in existence. In fact, when Man of War was voted on by the Urban County Council, when I was reading the article, apparently the fire department was objecting to Man of War because it would make it confusing because there's a Man of War place off South Broadway, near South Broadway. And they thought this would be confusing for fire personnel answering calls. But
yeah, and I was wondering if there are examples of controversial horse names, a street named after a horse, and some people opposed it, or I was wondering, there probably are some stories out there of things like that.
I haven't run into any controversies with any horse names, but again, I just research them. I don't look for, like I mentioned, Man of War had a little bit of a controversy only because the fire department had a concern that it resembled Man of War Place. But if we talk, if anything comes to me, I'll mention it to you.
Sounds good.
But those two roads, Man of War Boulevard and Oliver Lewis Way, are two of the more prominent names. Now, street names, subdivisions, and neighborhoods try to come up with themes for their neighborhood, the developer, if they can. And there are some subdivisions, neighborhood areas that I'd like to talk about that have a few horse names in their neighborhood. The first one's the Meadows, out there off of north of Loudon Avenue, between Loudon Avenue and New Circle Road. And it's a neighborhood on the north end of town. And Elijah Warfield had a mansion and a horse farm on the land where that subdivision now stands, and it was called the Meadows. And, of course, Meadow Lane comes from the Meadows. It's located on this land. Now, the famed thoroughbred Lexington was owned and bred by Warfield. And Lexington, when it was born, was not named Lexington. At the time, it was owned by Warfield, and its name was Darley. When the horse was sold, when it was 1 or 2 years old, the new owner changed it to Lexington. But Darley Road Darley is the original name of Lexington. That's where you get Darley Road out there in the Meadows, the Meadow subdivision. The mare that Darley was born to was named Alex Carneal. That was the name of the horse. And that's where you get Carneal Road from.
Oh, okay.
So the Meadows has an interesting history with the farm, the mansion. I think the mansion was torn down in 1960. It's really a shame because it was a great work of architecture. It's not a subdivision, it's an apartment complex that has a emphasis on horse names, is Merrick Place. I used to live out in Merrick Place. I traveled these roads for years, and I wasn't curious at the time what the roads or what the complex was named after. But Merrick Place is another interesting horse race name theme area.
Uh-huh.
It's an apartment complex off the Tates Creek Road, right before you get to New Circle Road heading out of town. It's on the left-hand side there. And it was built on the farmland of J. Kyle Milam, who named his farm Merrick Place in honor of his favorite horse, Merrick. Merrick, who lived to the age of 38, and at the time of his death, I think it was 1941, he was listed as the oldest thoroughbred in the nation, 38 years old. That's a pretty good age for a horse.
Definitely.
And it was thought to be the oldest horse. Merrick won 62 races, and when he retired to a life of leisure at the Milam Farm. And visitors would go see, they called him the old man because of his age, but he was almost as famous as a man of war in terms of visitors just coming out and wanting to see Merrick. Now, when the apartment complex was being developed around 1965 on Milam's farm, it was named in honor of Merrick, the famous horse. And the streets in the complex were named after Milam and his horses. I lived on Milam Lane for many years. Had no clue, Didn't know the origin. Wasn't curious about it.
Yeah, it's Merrick. It's not just the restaurant, Merrick Inn. So.
Yeah, Merrick. Well, that's actually where Merrick is buried. He's buried in front of Merrick Inn, and I think there's a plaque out there. But I never noticed that when I was living out there. I was too busy doing other stuff. But another area that I'm sure we're all familiar with is the Hamburg area, named for the Hamburg farm, in which the entire Hamburg development is located. The farm itself was named after the horse Hamburg, which was owned by the founder of the farm, John E. Madden. Hamburg was sold by Madden, and he used the money to buy the first part of his farmland, which eventually grew to 2,000 or so acres. And of course, that farmland, a lot of the farmland eventually became what is known as Hamburg. Now, when you refer to the Hamburg area, probably not a lot of people know what it's named after, but they just know it's Hamburg. Right. Where's that restaurant located? It's out in Hamburg. Well, if you know Lexington, you know where Hamburg is.
Right. Or they might know about the farm, but not realize it's named after the horse.
Yeah. The horse, the farm is named after the horse, but everybody knows anything about traveling around Lexington. If you just say, "Oh, it's out in the Hamburg area," everybody knows where that is, out in near the interstate. Right. But okay, because of the horse history with Hamburg, many streets out there are named for famous horses. I'm sure we've all been on Sir Barton Way.
Right.
Sir Barton Way, a major road out at Hamburg, was named in honor of the first Triple Crown winner, Sir Barton, in 1919. And Sir Barton was bred by the Madden.
Oh, okay. I didn't know Sir Barton was you said the first Triple Crown winner? Okay.
It wasn't known as the Triple Crown back then. I don't think it became the term Triple Crown didn't really become prominent until the 30s, but he was the first Triple Crown winner. Derby, Preakness, and Belmont. And that was Sir Barton. Another Derby winner that has a street named for him out there on the old Madden farm is Plotted Place. Plotted was the 1898 Kentucky Derby winner. Alysheba Way was bred at Hamburg, was the 1987 Derby winner, and the name Alysheba was derived from the race horses Aladar and Beelsheba, from which Alysheba was foaled. Aladar, Ally, and then Beelsheba, Alysheba. So another interesting way horses are named. You have Flying Ebony Drive out there in Hamburg, and that was named in honor of the 1925 Derby winner. And then Paul Jones Way was named for the 1920 Derby winner. A couple other streets out that way, I think they're across the interstate, but still out at the Hamburg area, was Winning Colors Lane, the 1988 Derby winner. There's a Silver Charm Lane, 1997 Derby winner. So you can't go wrong with famous horses and street names.
There's so many. Yeah. It provides so many opportunities. And when you get like in those subdivisions back there,
and
lots of names.
Yeah, and my favorite name of all these streets, and I wish I could live on it, I really do, is Real Quiet Lane, the 1988 Derby winner, Real Quiet.
This makes me think we could do an episode on how horses are named as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. We actually have a book here in the Kentucky room, What's in a Name, which has a list of, not all of them, but quite a few Kentucky Derby winners and how they came about naming the Derby winners. And it's really quite interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Hamburg. Some other names out there that weren't actually Derby winners, but still have affiliation with the Hamburg farm, the Star Chute Parkway. Star Chute was a sire for many of the Madden bred stakes winners. Then you have Pink Pigeon Parkway.
A personal favorite of mine.
Isn't it? Okay.
Yes.
Pink Pigeon was sired by one of Madden's favorite horses, TV Lark. I remember TV Lark for some reason. I remember that name. But anyway, Pink Pigeon was sired by TV Lark, and since TV Lark was a favorite horse of the Maddens, they decided to name Pink Pigeon Parkway. I don't think there's a TV Lark road, though.
I haven't seen
TV Lark Parkway.
I haven't seen
or
it if there is.
Yeah, I haven't seen one, so, but we'll keep looking. Of course, you have Citation Boulevard, which runs from Leestown all the way over to Hamburg, and that was named after the 1948 Triple Crown winner. In this book here on Kentucky Derby winners, I think the owner or the owner's wife mentioned that they came up with the name Citation because he was born during World War II, and mentioned that there was a lot of citations in World War II. I don't know what she meant by that. Maybe citations for not using your gasoline rations properly or what. But that's how Citation got his name. There's War Admiral Way. Anybody that's watched the Seabiscuit movie might remember War Admiral Way because he had the match race with Seabiscuit. So all those streets out in Hamburg, or a lot of the streets, are affiliated with the Hamburg farm.
And some of these names that, like Madden and Marquis, those are familiar names that.
Yeah, the Marquis Cancer Center.
Right, exactly. There's just so much local history involved with these names, Kentucky and local history, and like I said earlier, you just don't always realize it.
Yeah. Well, growing up, I was not introduced to them literally, but the Maddens were known for their Derby parties. Anita Madden, so
legendary.
Every Kentucky Derby weekend, there'd be a big story in the Herald Leader about the Madden farm, and that was like the must-have invitation if you're going to celebrate the Kentucky Derby. I never got invited. Haven't lost any sleep over it, but those were very prominent social events back in the day. Nobody could throw a Derby party like Anita Madden. Now, another area, subdivision, is the Gainesway Southeastern Hills neighborhood. They kind of adjoin each other, so I included both of them together. Now, the Gainesway area has an interesting history. Gainesway Farm was bought and named in 1944 by the founder of the Gaines Dog Food Company. Now, I hate to mention dog food and horses in the same podcast, but it is what it is. And early on, the Gainesway Farm was a top standard bred farm, which eventually developed into thoroughbred breeding and so forth. And when the Gainesway subdivision was developed, I think beginning in 1957, which is kind of when I was developed, they decided to honor the farm and horses with naming a bunch of the streets after horse farms, Derby winners, and so forth. This includes Southeastern Hills, which, like I said, I'm combining the two. They adjoin each other. And some of the horse farms that were named were the Crown Crest Road, named after the Crown Crest Horse Farm, Green Tree Road, another horse farm name, High Hope Road. You got the Crimson King Court out there, which was named after a horse farm. And some of the more interesting to me were Castleton Way, which speaks for itself, Castleton Farm. Spendthrift Road in Court is located.
Okay.
It's named in honor of the Spendthrift Farm, horse farm. And the farm was named after a 19th century thoroughbred owned by Daniel Swigert. Swigert named the horse in reference to his wife's excessive spending spree in New York City that she took, and he decided he was going to honor his wife's spending habits by naming a horse Spendthrift.
So he was celebrating her spending.
I guess
sounds
so.
like.
Yeah, I guess so. But that's an interesting thing. I'm quite familiar with the Gainesway area because our school bus used to go through there. And when I worked as a district manager at Terrell Leader, that was my area. So I know those streets. But I never, I think, again, at the time, you never really think about it.
Right.
But another road out there is Elmendorf Drive in Court. That was named, of course, for the Elmendorf Horse Farm, which was located on Paris Pike. And the owner named Elmendorf in honor of his wife's paternal grandmother, who was named Blanche Elmendorf. So that's how he came up with the name for the horse farm. Those are all interesting places and street names. And a lot of the streets out there are affiliated with famous racetracks like Gulfstream Drive. You have Santa Anita Court, Aqueduct Drive in New York, Beulah Park. So a lot of racetracks are honored out there. And then I have some miscellaneous horses I'll just run by. And I know David and I talked about this because you're talking one time about when you were born. We won't name any dates here, but Ruffian Way, which is off Leestown Road. For those of us old enough to remember, Ruffian was a famous filly racehorse who tragically died in a match race with the Kentucky Derby winner in 1975. Sorry, David. Foolish Pleasure. And they had a match race, and Ruffian broke down, and it was pretty heartbreaking because the match race was, I think, aired nationwide, and I think Ruffian survived for a couple of days, and finally they had to put her down. And it was for those that love horse racing and horses, that one was a tough one. Furlong Drive off of Harrodsburg Road is another street name that's affiliated with horse racing. The developer, Ted Osborne, and we'll talk more about Ted Osborne in the next podcast on street names, because I consider Ted Osborne, from my research, like the most creative developer of coming up with street names. He was pretty good at it. Well, anyway, he named Furlong Drive after the unit of length used in horse racing, the furlong.
Uh-huh.
And the length of the street equaled exactly how much a furlong in a horse race was.
Uh-huh.
So that's how they came up with that name. You have, of course, the Red Mile Road. Got to talk about the Trotters. That opened up in the early 1970s, and it's named after the Red Mile racetrack out there. Race Street. It's so named because of its location to the old Kentucky Association racetrack, which closed in, I believe, last meet was in 1933. Kingland came about in 1936, but Race Street was named because it was right where the old racetrack was. Another area, the old Healy Farm out there in the Beaumont area. He had a massive farm out there, and there's some streets out there like Georgian Way, which was a horse owned by Hal Price Headley.
Is that the same Headley of Mason Headley?
I think so. You know what? That's one of the streets. I got a list about 20 streets that I'm like, I got to find these names. And Mason Headley is one of those I just can't find in a newspaper. But just putting two together, I'm thinking it's named after Silas Mason, who owned a farm off for Sales Road in the Mason Headley area called Duntreath Farm.
Okay.
And then, of course, you got Hal Price Headley, who helped found Kingland. He had a farm over the Beaumont. My guess would be Mason was Silas Mason, and Headley was. Okay. But the only mention I found in all the newspaper, I belong to newspapers.com, and I've looked these things up, and only mention I found was a letter to the editor where some guy was referring to Mason Headley Road and said it was to honor Hal Price Headley, but it doesn't say. I don't think it says anything about Silas Mason.
And I'm sure people constantly, always think Mason Headley was a person, but it's very likely two different names put together.
Yeah, I was actually going to save that for the second podcast, and I'll still mention the second podcast. And if anybody's out there listening, any old-time Lexingtonians, if you want to call us here in the Kentucky room to verify that, my guess is Silas Mason and Hal Price Headley, the Headley farm. I have not found anything to document that, and believe me, I've looked. Another road out there at the old Beaumont Farm was the Old Nassau Road. That's a horse that was owned by Healy, Old Nassau. And then Athenia Drive was named in honor of a horse owned by Healy called Athenia. So that area was pretty big with horse history. And Hal Price Healy, which we'll be talking about in our talk that we're going to have in a couple weeks on the history of horse racing in Lexington, was a major contributor to the horse racing industry in the 20th century. Another area out in the north end, Rookwood Parkway. Rookwood used to be a horse farm, which I think was located off Bryan Station Pike, and that's how Rookwood got its name. Hernando Alley, I'm sure you all have heard of Hernando Building, the Hernando Building. Well, that was named for the early 20th century thoroughbred stallion, Hernando. And before they built this new parking lot off Water Street between Water and Vine, that's how I used to get to work every day. Coming down Vine and taking a left onto Hernando. So whenever anybody asks me where Hernando is, I say, well, I can tell you where it is because I traveled every day. Unfortunately, I can't cut through the parking lot to get to work anymore. One more thing I'd like to mention is the old Calumet farm that is named after the Calumet Baking Powder Company of Chicago. That company was founded by the Calumet owner at the time, William Monroe Wright, and he decided to name the farm after the baking powder company in Chicago.
Okay. I never knew that.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Calumet, of course, had numerous Derby winners. So, we have a interesting history of naming streets here in town. And like I said before, they had the contest for Oliver Lewis Way, and they had the council voting for Man of War. But basically, it's up to the developers to come up with a name or name theme, and then take it down to the city planning office, and then they have to approve it. It's not a fun job for a lot of these guys.
Mm-hmm.
But all these roads that we mentioned today have a connection with horse racing, and horse racing is a big thing here in Kentucky, as we all know.
Mm-hmm.
You can say we built this city on horse racing. One of the things we built it on. It's always been a popular sport. Lots of history behind it.
Right, definitely.
And we've honored our horse racing history with some of these street names that we mentioned today.
Mm-hmm. So many opportunities to learn your local history through reading about these street names. Well, Wayne, you've given us a great introduction to Lexington street names. Your knowledge of Lexington history is so vast. So this is a really, really interesting topic.
I appreciate that. I try to have a little bit of horse sense.
Of course.
And the second podcast that we'll be doing here in a few months, we'll do a podcast on non-horse related street names, because there's some interesting street names non-horse related.
Yeah, and to talk a little bit of how they've changed and reasons why and stuff like that. Just to, again, point out that we do have lots of events going on this summer at the library. The week of June 5th, we're doing a Secretariat week where we're going to show the movie Secretariat in the Farish Theater. Wayne is going to do a program on the history of horse racing in Lexington, and we also have a children's story time, a horse story time with an activity for kids as well. And all that information is on our events page on our website. But yeah, we've got lots of great events. And I'd also like to point out that we have another podcast, The History of Horse Racing in Lexington, that was done with Foster Ackerman a while back. So that would be a great thing to listen to as well. Wayne, thanks again for sharing your knowledge with us.
Thanks for listening to Tales from the Kentucky Room, a podcast brought to you by the Central Library's Kentucky Room staff at the Lexington Public Library. If you enjoyed listening, please take a minute to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts and Stitcher. If you have any questions about local history or genealogy research, you can visit us in the Kentucky Room to use our collection and newspaper microfilm, or you can email us at elibrarian@lexpublib.org. That's elibrarian@lexpublib.org. I'm Miriam, and we'll be back with another trip down Lexington's memory lane.